Social Exchange. Joining me today is Johann Hari. Johann is a journalist and a writer. He's the author of Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, which is groundbreaking and best-selling. And today we will speak about his latest and brand new book called Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Right, as if you needed an introduction at all. Johann, thank you so much for being with me.
Hi, Zach. It's really good to talk to you again.
Well, it wasn't enough for you to turn the whole addiction concept on its head. You have now, with captivating prose and robust research, done the same thing for our notion of mental health, specifically depression and anxiety. Before we get to the three main sections of that book, will you give a quick overview of its themes and describe what exactly sparked your interest in the topic enough to make it a book project?
I guess the main reason I started writing, I actually put off writing this book and wrote Chasing the Scream in the meantime. And I know it sounds crazy to say I found it easier to spend time with hitmen from the Mexican drug cartels than I did to think about the nature of my own depression and anxiety. But for some reason I did. And I think the main reason I started working on Lost Connections because there were these two mysteries that were really kind of haunting me. And I wasn't being told the answers by our culture. I had been taking antidepressants with a couple of short breaks for 13 years since I was a teenager. And when I had gone to the doctor when I was a teenager and I'd said that I had this feeling like kind of pain was leaking out of me and I couldn't regulate it and I didn't know what to do, my doctor told me a story. This was the 90s when people all over the world were being told this story, and there's really a variant of it being told to everyone now, which is some people have, so there's a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. Some people are naturally lacking that chemical. You're clearly one of them. I'm going to give you these drugs and you're going to feel normal again. And I felt a tremendous amount of relief and joy, really, when I was told that, because being given a story for your pain is a tremendous relief, especially if it's a story that has a solution. And I started taking antidepressants, chemical antidepressants. It's one called Paxil in the United States. And I remember the first time I took one, it felt like a kind of chemical kiss. I felt this tremendous sense of relief. And for a couple of months, I felt significantly better. And then this pain started to kind of come back through. So I went back to the doctor. He said, oh, clearly you're not on a high enough dose. He gave me more. Again, I had a couple of months where I felt better, and then it came back. And this was basically the pattern that continued until I was taking the maximum dose you're allowed to take. And then I continued being depressed. So I guess the first mystery was, why after 13 years was I still depressed when, according to the story our culture tells, I was being fixed? And then I discovered that, in fact, far from being kind of freakish, my experience was absolutely the standard experience on chemical antidepressants. Between 65 and 80% of people, depending on which study you look at, on chemical antidepressants are depressed again within a year. So I was like, well, how can this be? What's going on? And the second question was not just why was I still depressed, but why were so many other people like me? You know, when I was a kid, some of the members of my family would take kind of psychiatric medication. And I remember when I was a kid, that was really unusual. I remember I would go and stay at friends' houses and it would, I would notice that just never happened with any other family. But a funny thing happened as the decades passed, which was the whole of Western civilization caught up with my family. Now, 1 in 5 Americans takes a psychiatric drug. 1 in 3 middle-aged women is taking a chemical antidepressant. About 1 in 11 of the people around you are on chemical antidepressants at any given time. So we've suddenly, even if you're not taking them, when the water supply is tested, it always contains a trace element of antidepressants because so many of us are taking them and urinating them out. We are literally awash in these drugs. And this, of course, is happening against the backdrop of the wider evidence of despair that you and I have talked about before, whether it's the opioid crisis, the extraordinary increase in the suicide rate. So I was like, well, what has happened? It seemed to me it could not be that just all of us individually were having our brain chemistries go awry mysteriously at the same time. That the more I thought about it, I thought that can't be right. So I wanted to really understand the answers to these mysteries. So I ended up going, like with my previous book, on a really big journey. I ended up going over 40,000 miles around the world and back again, from all sorts of places, from San Francisco to Sydney, from Buenos Aires to Berlin, really meeting with the leading scientists in the world who've been looking into depression and anxiety, and people who've been through depression and anxiety, people who've come out the other side, and just really a crazy mixture of people. So ended up, going to an Amish village in Indiana, to a Berlin housing project where they had discovered this extraordinary way of overcoming depression, to a city in Brazil that had banned advertising to see if that would improve people's mental health, to a lab in Johns Hopkins University where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I think the main thing I learned is that the story we've been told about depression and anxiety up to now is wrong. That depression and anxiety are not caused by chemical imbalances in our brain. There are some biological factors that contribute to depression and anxiety. They're not a chemical imbalance in our brains. It really shocked me to discover that, in fact, there's no evidence that depression is caused by spontaneous chemical imbalance in our brains, and lots of evidence that it isn't. And that there are these very different explanations, or very different reasons why we're feeling this way. And once you understand those very different reasons, you actually begin to find real solutions, kind of antidepressants, if we think about antidepressants in a very different way, that do work.
Johann, last we talked, it was about 8 months ago. I believe you were just finishing the final draft of this book, and I was just beginning to write mine, which shares so many of the themes that you describe in the book, Lost Connections. All of that to say, as I read this book, I found myself dizzy from nodding my head so furiously in agreement. But that's just me. If we turn, as you aptly point out, to the general public and ask, what causes depression? How do we treat it? Most people wouldn't need a book to explain that, well, it's caused by a chemical imbalance and it can reasonably be treated with antidepressants. So, as you alluded to just a moment ago, can you tell me, as you do so effectively in the book, what is the problem with the standard story?
Well, I'm not critical of those people. I was one of those people for those 13 years. People can look this up. I evangelized for that way of thinking about depression. There's many ways to talk about what's wrong with it, but I want to tell you a small story that really helped me to think about it differently. There's a South African psychiatrist called Derek Sommerfeld. And in the early part of this century, he went to Cambodia. He was doing some research there. And it was just as antidepressants were being introduced in Cambodia. And he was talking to these Cambodian doctors, and they said, oh, we don't need these chemical antidepressants. We already have antidepressants. And Derek thought they were going to talk about some herbal remedy, St. John's wort or something. And he said, well, what is it? And they said, oh, well, we'll give you an example of a good antidepressant. There was a farmer who worked in the fields, rice fields, a rice farmer. And one day he stood on a landmine left by the American war, and his leg was blown off. And so they gave him an artificial leg. They're pretty good with that in Cambodia. And he went back to working in his field. But it was very painful to work in water when you have an artificial leg. And I'm imagining he was pretty traumatized because he's working in the field where he's been blown up.
Right.
And the guy got really distressed, and he would cry all the time. He didn't want to get out of bed. And they said to Derek, that's depression, right? And Derek said, yeah, that's right. And they said, right, so we gave him an antidepressant. What we did is we went and we sat with him, and we listened to his problem. And we thought, well, if he was a dairy farmer, he wouldn't have to be working in this field where it would be really painful and he's got all these terrible memories. So we bought him a cow. And he had this cow, and he started to milk it, and that was what he did. And before long, he stopped crying, and he's happy now. So you see, doctor, they said to him, that cow was an antidepressant. And of course, Derek intuitively knew that this was right. He began to think about his own work as a psychiatrist, and he thought, actually, times when I make a really substantial difference are usually the times when I've helped someone improve their life. And it's a funny thing, this, because in some ways, I feel like Lost Connections and the things that I learned from these incredible scientists all over the world are at once radical and shockingly banal, right? Like, at one sense, they're radical because we've been so propagandized into this story that depression is a purely biological phenomenon. As I say, there are biological elements, I'm sure we'll get to talking about them, but that it's a purely biological phenomenon that's not related to life. Actually, it's overwhelmingly related to the way we live. I talk in the book about the scientific evidence for 9 proven causes of depression and anxiety, 2 of which are biological, 7 of which are factors in our wider lives and the way we live together. And some of those things are kind of quite obvious in some ways, although I think there's a lot of nuances to them that it helps when you drill down into the detail. So, for example, if you are disconnected from other people, if you're profoundly lonely, there's evidence that's one of the big drivers of depression around us. If you feel your work is meaningless, that there's lots of evidence that will make you depressed and anxious in a lot of cases. Some of those things, some of them are less obvious, and I'm sure we'll get to them as well. But I think it's an incredible kind of propaganda victory that these quite obvious points that depression is a response to life. It is a necessary signal that something has gone wrong in our culture. And the solution is what those Cambodian doctors knew absolutely instinctively. Well, find out why the person is depressed and deal with the reason, rather than trying to muffle the symptom. Deal with the underlying reason. And that, to me, is the core insight that we've lost. And there are solutions to these problems. Some of them are quite straightforward. Some of them require bigger changes. But to really have a solution, we have to look at what's actually causing it. And it's not a problem in our brain. So to talk about the flaws in this kind of brain chemistry theory, and again, this shocked me, and I was very resistant to it for a really long time, and really put off looking into a lot of this. Because when you've got a story about your distress, even if it's one that doesn't work very well, at least it gives you some sense that you understand what's going on.
Right.
It's like you're paying to some degree on a leash, and then dismantling that story can feel like, you're letting this beast off a leash, where you won't be able to control or understand it. But so I think it was one of the people who was a real guide to me is Irving Kirsch, an incredible man. He's a professor at Harvard, one of the leading experts in the world on the effects of chemical antidepressants. And Irving pointed out many important things to me, but one of the most important is the overwhelming majority of people on antidepressants are depressed again within a year. So whatever you think about antidepressants, they can't be chemical antidepressants. They can't be the solution for most people most of the time. But at the moment, for depressed people, we basically have one thing on the menu, which is these drugs. But what Irving's discoveries related to, which I think was even more shocking, is it was when Irving realized antidepressants are not working for the big majority of his patients and people who are taking them, he then began to investigate the origins of this idea that depression is caused by a spontaneous chemical imbalance in your brain. That story I was told by my doctor. And that's when he really discovered there's just no evidence for that. I mean, Dr. David Healy, who's one of the leading British experts on antidepressants, said to me, you can't even say that the serotonin story is discredited, because there was never a time when it was credited. There was never a time when you would have had half of the people in the field who believed that. He said, the reason it became popular is because it was basically picked up by drug company PRs as a story that makes it seem that what happens is these chemicals restore us to the natural state everyone else has. That's not true. They create an unnatural state. Now, for some people, that unnatural state is, for a small minority, that unnatural state is beneficial. For most people, it's not. And so that to me was really shocking, because once you realize that it's not a chemical imbalance that's driving this, you then have to look at, well, what is causing it? And that was the bigger part of the journey. And once you understand what's causing it, you can begin to think like those Cambodian doctors about how to solve it.
That's going to be a tough bit to sell. I mean, antidepressants, you learned, are not only no more effective than a placebo. Well, I guess in some minority of cases, it can be slightly better. But all the while, their side effects are very real too. Talk about what some of the side effects are, some of the very real side effects at the cost of possibly no effect of the drug.
Well, it's very important to say I'm not making a case against chemical antidepressants. That's not my goal here. Anyone listening to this who's taking chemical antidepressants, and feels it helps, I'm certainly not saying they should stop. What I'm trying to do is have a more realistic conversation about chemical antidepressants, which is the key facts being, firstly, most people taking them are still depressed. We really have to hammer away at that point, right? That doesn't mean they have no value, but that can't continue to be the main thing we offer, especially when there are, in fact, solutions that do work. Secondly, as you say, these are very powerful drugs. No one disputes that. And whether they agree that they have the strong antidepressant effect, and that is very disputed, they are certainly very, very potent chemicals. And 70% of people experience sexual dysfunction, increases which, by the way, sex is one of the most powerful natural antidepressants we have. And it takes that away from a lot of people. And there's a whole range of. I mean, I do think some of the claims are overstated. I think the link to violence, when you look at the evidence, is not true. Or certainly not been established scientifically. But there are a huge. I mean, I put on an enormous amount of weight. I put on, I think, 3 stone very quickly within. By the time within about a year of taking them, and it went away, very rapidly when I stopped taking them. So there's all sorts of side effects. But I'm not interested in taking away any antidepressants. What I want to do is expand the concept of what antidepressants are, because there are all sorts of things we can do, social and psychological interventions, changes in the way we live collectively and individually, that really significantly reduce depression and anxiety. And I think we should be thinking about those as antidepressants. The moment we picture antidepressants as a pack of pills, that should definitely remain one of the things on the table. But we need a menu that thinks of lots of things as antidepressants. Anything that reduces depression is an antidepressant. And we need to be thinking about the evidence about what really does work for that. So can I give you a concrete example? Because that can sound a bit weird if you say it out of context. So there's really strong evidence that the way we are working today is causing depression and anxiety. I don't mean just causing unhappiness, causing really serious depression and anxiety. I tell the story in the book of a guy called Joe, who I got to know in Philly. Standard guy, there's nothing particularly outstanding about his story. He works in a paint store. If you go into his paint store, you say what shade you want, and he has to put the powder into a little palette, and then he puts the paint into a machine, and it shakes up. It's to make sure that the paint is even, basically. And then he'll take your money, you'll say thank you, leave, and then he waits for the next person to come in and show the shade of paint, and then he puts it in the machine, and on and on and on. That's his life, right? And when I met Joe, he was really depressed, and he would talk about this in a very conflicted way, because he was very grateful he had a job. He felt quite ashamed that he was so depressed, actually. And after speaking to Joe, he'd actually contacted me about chasing the scream, because for a time he'd had an oxy addiction, although he'd left that behind by the time, long time before I met him. When I got talking to Joe, and I thought a lot about how many people I know, their depression focuses on and anxiety focus on feelings about their work. I started to look for evidence about this. Gallup, the opinion poll company, did the most detailed study that's ever been done of how people feel about their work in our culture. What it found is 13% of us like our jobs. We look forward to it. We get energy from our work most of the time. 63% are what they called sleepwalking through their work. So they don't like it, they don't hate it, they're just sleepwalking through the day. And 24% of people hate their jobs. They dread it, they want to fuck it up, they really hate it. So you think about that, right? That's 87% of people who don't like their work. And you're twice as likely to hate your work as love your work. And this is the thing we do most of the time, right? I think the figure is the average person checks their first work email at 7:43 a.m. and leaves work at 7:15 p.m. So this is, most of us, our lives are dominated by something that's at best sleepwalking, right? And I started to think, well, could there be any relationship between this and depression? And if there is, what could we do about it? And I discovered there was, in fact, a study that had really honed in on what it is about work that can cause depression and anxiety. It's by an Australian social scientist called Michael Marmot. He's an amazing man. And he'd actually done this research in Britain. So in the 70s, he'd done this study on a slightly different subject that then led to this breakthrough about depression. And when he started the study, people said it was stupid to even do it because the answer was so obvious. He wanted to look at organizations. He wanted to figure out who in an organization is most likely to have a stress-related heart attack. Is it the boss? Is it the person 5 layers down from the boss? Is it the person 15 layers down from the boss? And everyone said, look, Michael, this is dumb. Obviously, the boss is going to be most likely to have a heart attack. He's got the most responsibility, and so on. So Michael studied the British civil service, who are the bureaucrats who run the bureaucracy for the British government, basically. And there were 19 layers of the British civil service at that time, from the boss at the top to at the time, this was the 70s, they would have been the women in the typing pool. And when he came back with the results, what he found really shocked people. It was the exact opposite of what people expected. The lower down you went in the hierarchy, the more likely you were to have a stress-related heart attack. And that's when he looked at the figures and found the same was true of depression. The lower down you went, the more likely you were to become depressed. And Michael was like, well, what's going on here? How do we figure this out? So he then started comparing people who worked at the same level at the civil service, so say the 13th level, to figure out to look at people whose jobs differed at the same level. So, well, if we can figure out what the difference is, then we can figure out what's really going on. And that's when he discovered these two factors that cause depression at work. One of them is a lack of control. If you don't have any control over your work, your chances of becoming depressed really significantly increased. And this is the best theory for this, which I think is true, is that human beings have an innate need to feel that what we're doing is meaningful, to feel connected to the meaning of what we do day by day, hour by hour. If you don't have that, you'll become quite distressed. The other is what he called an imbalance between efforts and rewards. So no matter how hard you work, the rewards are the same. So it feels like nobody notices you. No one's seeing what you're doing. In one way, your work is irrelevant. It's meaningless. So this causes depression, right? It's really important to say this is a cause, full-blown depression for really significant numbers of people. And at first when I learned that, I thought, oh, geez, this is actually quite it's easy to misunderstand this, because I was thinking, well, if meaningless work is driving depression, look, there are a lot of jobs that my family do and have done that, are not the most exciting jobs in the world, right? And I thought, well, if meaningless work is going to depress, well, there's some forms of work that are not going to be so exciting and have to be done. So, oh no, we're just setting people up for depression. But then I discovered that's actually not true. That actually any form of work can be infused with meaning in a specific way. You can deal with these causes of depression and anxiety in how people work. So in Baltimore, I went and met this woman called Meredith Keogh. Meredith was, she used to go to bed every Sunday night and just feel her heart racing. She would feel terribly anxious. And, she had an office job. It wasn't the worst job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or anything. But she just didn't feel it had any meaning or purpose. And she thought, oh, this is going to be my life for the next 40 years. And so she quit her job and she did this thing with her husband, Josh, that again, people thought was a bit kind of crazy. So Josh had been working in bike stores in Baltimore since he was a teenager. And, you can guess, I'm sure that's pretty insecure work. Your boss obviously orders you around. You don't have much autonomy. You don't have much of a sense of the future. You don't have many benefits. And Josh and his friends decided, one day they were kind of like, what does the boss actually do? Because they liked the boss, but they were like, well, we fix all the bikes, right? Yeah. So they decided to set up a bike store that they would run differently. So they didn't want to be controlled. They didn't want to be controlling anyone else. What they did is they set up a bike store. There were initially 6 of them, which they ran as a democratic cooperative. So that meant that they took the important decisions together. They would share out the better jobs and the worse jobs. They would share the profit. So it would be like a little democratic tribe. There's lots of businesses that work like this, obviously. So I went to Baltimore Bicycle Works, which is now a very thriving business. People can order bikes from it online as well. And I spoke to people there. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is how many of them talk. There's now 9 of them. How many of them, when they had worked in previous environments, which are these top-down environments, they had felt quite a lot of anxiety and depression. Not all of them, but most of them. And how quickly that had gone away in this new environment. It's not they didn't have difficult days. Of course they did. There were some days when they, like everyone, you have to motivate yourself. But there was those chronic feelings of depression and anxiety had gone away because they had dealt with these 2 causes, right? They had control over their work and they felt people saw them, their colleagues saw them.
Right.
They could infuse their work with meaning. And what's important to say about that is it's not, look, they fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now, right? It's not like they quit their jobs fixing bikes and went off to, teach people surfing in Jamaica or something. The nature of their work remained the same. What they dealt with was the aspects that make people depressed. And when I spoke to Josh, the guy who helped to set this up and co-runs it, he said to me, it's such a propaganda victory for our system that we tell people they're free when they're so controlled in the thing they do almost all the time. And he said, there's no reason why any business should be run in this top-down depression and anxiety-creating way. Actually, there's pretty good evidence from a big study at Cornell University that democratically run businesses grow much faster than top-down businesses, because Baltimore Bicycle Works have got 9 brains on every problem, whereas the bike store they used to work in had 1 brain, right? So and they've got a lot more enthusiasm and energy for their work because they know it's theirs. It's not this deadened, humiliating thing. So that's one example. That's a big example, but that's one example of a thing that's driving a lot of depression and anxiety, and how we can solve it. Now, I would say what Josh and Meredith chose was an antidepressant. They saw why they were depressed and unhappy, and they built a different way of living that dealt with that.
I just wanted to ask you a question about that, because what I'm just thinking about now is that, to go back to the topic that you were trying to move away from, but for good reason, I just was thinking about that term placebo. So when we say, oh, you take antidepressants, it's typically no better than a placebo. If you think about what that real phenomenon of the placebo is, I suppose it's really a term to describe a person's optimistic belief in something. Which is interesting, because now there are a few things to parse. How much of depression, anxiety, do you think can be attributed to the job itself, like you were describing, or just sort of the outlook about what the job somebody is doing is? And also, how much do you think can be attributed? Of course, there's no numerical value, but how much do you think can be attributed to the fact that when some people, if they take antidepressants and see that nothing's changing or they're feeling no better, that they may be bound to those things and feel a loss of control in that sense?
I think it's a really good question. I think the psychological concepts that you bring to any situation will guide your behavior in that situation. So I don't think we should separate out the psychological concepts you bring to it from your behavior, because one leads to the other, right? So I don't think it's the attitude you bring to it. I think it's that. So let me give you a concrete example of a study that really helped me to think about this. So this is another way of thinking, I think, about the kind of despair that's spreading across our culture. It's a really interesting study by a social scientist at Berkeley. She's actually at Toronto now, but when I went to go and see her, she was at Berkeley, called Dr. Brett Ford. And she, with her colleagues, was responsible for this study that looked at, if you consciously decide you are going to dedicate a lot of time to being happy, will you in fact become happier? And they did this study in the United States, with colleagues there, obviously, in the United States, Taiwan, Russia, and Japan. And what they found was really interesting. If you try to be consciously happier in the United States, you do not become happier. If you decide to try to become consciously happier in Japan, Russia, and Taiwan, you do become happier. And they were like, well, how can that be? What's going on? And when they looked at it in more detail, what they discovered is, in the US, and I'm sure this would be true in Britain, if you consciously try to become happier, what you do is you do something for yourself. You buy stuff for yourself. You big yourself up. You try to go for a promotion, something like that. In the other places, in these Eastern countries, that's not what people did. In fact, when they wanted to be happier, what they did is they did something for someone else, for their family, for their group, for something bigger. So we have an individualistic concept of happiness. We think to make yourself happy, you do stuff for yourself. They have a collectivist sense of happiness. Now, this is obviously generalizations, there's exceptions to both societies, but they have a more collectivist sense. They instinctively know that the way to happiness is through the group. Now, this individualistic way of thinking, which is very deep in our culture, though it's always coexisted with other ways of thinking, is, really, really making us depressed and unhappy. It's no way to live. It's not, because the thing that connected so many of these studies that I was looking at, as I spoke to so many different people all over the world who were trying to think about depression and anxiety differently, was this realization. So you think about the chemical imbalance story we've been told up to now. In a way, the different story I found was more about, we need to think about psychological needs. So everyone listening to this knows that human beings have natural physical needs, right? We need shelter, we need food, we need water, all of those things. there's equally good evidence that we have innate psychological needs, right? There are things that human beings need to be psychologically healthy. We need to feel we belong to a group. We need to feel we have a stable future. We need to feel that we are valued and loved. We need to feel we have meaning and purpose in our lives. And there's very strong evidence that many of these innate psychological needs are just not being met by our culture. They're decreasingly being met by our culture. And as a result, we are becoming more depressed and anxious. Now, that's a totally different way of thinking, because what that means is, when my doctor was talking to me when I was a teenager, what he should have been saying was not, you're a machine with broken parts, but you're a human being with unmet needs. And this story we've been telling actually divorces people from understanding the primary drivers of their pain. I want to stress that biological factors can make it worse. That's really important to stress. It's not wholly environmental and psychological. But once you understand it's your psychological needs not being met. Now, what I don't want to do is throw that back on the individual, right? We don't say, I don't know, let's think about car accidents. We don't say that the job of reducing traffic accidents should remain only with people who've just been mangled in a terrible car crash, right? We don't go to the people who just, we're speaking just after this terrible Amtrak disaster in Washington State. We don't go to the people who, we're not going to go to the ERs and say to those people, it's your job to, make sure trains don't go too fast, right? What we do is we have collective rules. We build a society where we've reduced car accidents by having rules for everyone that make everyone safer, right? In the same way, we've put all of the onus on solving depression and anxiety onto the depressed individual. There are things the depressed individual can do. But if this is a problem caused by the way we're living, all of us, and actually the factors that are making some people acutely depressed and anxious are making most people unhappy, that leads to a very different way of thinking. Then we have to actually have collective change, which takes some of the burden off of the depressed individual, their families and their doctors, who've been asked to solve problems that cannot be solved by those people alone, because we have to deal with the deeper issues. Now, there are things all of those people can do, obviously. I'm not saying there's nothing they can do. There's a lot they can do, but it can't be solved alone. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, let's see. I want to talk about that study, about this concept with regard to the study between people trying to be happy in the U.S., or you say decided to be happy in the U.S., versus people deciding to be happy, consciously making an effort to be happy in Japan. So what I think you're sort of laying out is that, you can just see in the book, you have all sorts of different things that could lead to disconnection and depression. You could have all sorts of things that could lead you to a reconnection and being more engaged with life. Do Americans, and I guess people around the Western world, have a tough time trying to parse the different nuances? That is, if I decide I'm just going to get to an end goal, am I missing some of the smaller steps an American might not know? Like, I work with children, and a lot of parents and a lot of teachers often ignore the great value of a child being able to make slow and slight but steady steps toward a short-term goal. And once that happens and momentum gets underway, success starts to happen. So I wonder if that is part of it. And then I guess the other part that you're saying is that it's not just that individuals themselves have a hard time understanding what creates happiness. It's good to be able to have individuals be educated about this, but it is sort of a connection crisis, can we say, as a whole and as a culture. Is that right?
I think that's totally true. And I think one of the things that's fascinating to me, and one of the many things that gives me hope, is that these insights are just below the surface. And when you give people ways to act on these insights, you see how they flower. I'll give you an example. There's a doctor's surgery in East London where a wonderful doctor called Dr. Sam Everington was really concerned because he had a lot of people coming to him who were depressed and anxious, and him and his colleagues were just drugging them. And when he spoke to them about their lives, what he would see is actually these people had perfectly rational reasons to be depressed, that they weren't suffering from a chemical imbalance in their brains. They were suffering from a social and spiritual imbalance in their lives. They were often lonely. They were or facing real problems. And it's not that he's against chemical antidepressants. He continues to prescribe them, but he he just thought we've got to be offering more than this. So he pioneered this really interesting approach, which is called social prescribing. So in addition to giving people a drug if they wanted one, what he would do is prescribe for them to take part in a group, doing something collectively together. So I'll give you an example: a woman called Lisa Cunningham, who was one of the people Sam prescribed to take part in a group. There was an area. There was a patch of land close to the doctor's surgery that people called Dog Shit Alley. It was just a kind of beat up bit of scrubland. And what they did is they said to this group of, I think it was about 20 depressed and anxious people, they gave them a member of staff to support them, and they said, will you guys just make this beautiful? Will you guys just meet a few times a week and over the next few months turn this into something lovely? And so this group of depressed and anxious people who were sick of talking about their depression and anxiety started just learning gardening. Lisa had barely been out of her house for 7 years, and she was terrified when she first went. And these people start to reconnect with two things. They start to reconnect with each other. They would start by talking about the gardening, and often they would talk more about their lives. And they would just reconnect with nature, even just a patch of scrubland. They just physically putting their hands in the dirt gives you a sense of a different perspective. You realize the bigness of the world. And there's been a study of similar programs in Norway that found that they are twice as effective as chemical antidepressants, because it's dealing with, now we need better research on this. That study in Norway is not great, but it's the beginning of and it's very revealing that no one's funding any research into these different ways of thinking. And that's a slight overstatement. There's very little money in funding this. There's not none. Because who's going to profit from it, right? Antidepressants are a $10 billion chemical antidepressants are a $10 billion industry. No one's making any money out of Lisa reconnecting with another group of depressed people and building a beautiful garden. And so again, that points to it. And what's interesting to me is it didn't take long for any of them to see the value of it, right? Going around talking to people about this, it's a bit like the previous things you and I have talked about, like Rat Park. It's not like when you explain these things to people, it's not like, I don't know, the theory of relativity or Chomsky's linguistics or something, where actually it's a really complex thing. It's a big leap. It's really hard to get your head round. It's not even like explaining some complex thing about tax policy. Actually, people intuitively understand these truths very quickly. I actually think it's harder to explain, if people hadn't heard it before, it's harder to explain these chemical imbalance stories. Like, think about those Cambodian doctors who were just baffled by it, than it is to explain that depression and anxiety are signals. One of the things that really shocks Europeans, I spend a lot of my time in the US. One thing that really shocks Europeans when we come to the US is the existence of indigestion tablets, right? They just don't exist in France and Germany or Britain. I've never seen them, right? Because if you offered an indigestion tablet to a French person, they would say, but indigestion is a signal from your body that you're eating too fast. That's a necessary signal. It's horrible, it's uncomfortable, but it's a necessary signal. You don't want to get rid of that because then you'll eat too much, right? You'll eat too quickly, you'll make yourself sick. And in a similar way, I'm obviously not saying that depression and anxiety are good things. They are terrible. I'm not putting forward like a stoicist view or what some variants of Buddhism would say, which is we just have to learn to live with these states. They're just, we have to learn to live with the pain. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is depression and anxiety are signals that we are going in the wrong direction. And even if we could numb ourselves to them, which we can't, these drugs are not numbing them to them. But even if we could, that would not be a good idea, because these signals are telling us that we're not living in a way that's compatible with our human nature, and therefore we're not getting the most out of life. And actually, we need to, instead of insulting those signals, we need to listen to them. I'll give you a good one of the ways that really helped me to understand this. In the 70s, there was this discovery about the symptoms of depression that was really awkward and inconvenient and a bit explosive. So it's been kind of brushed under the carpet. So when psychiatrists were writing the edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, the kind of psychiatric Bible in the early 70s, for the first time, they wanted to standardize how depression was diagnosed in the US and across the world. So they wrote out a list of 10 symptoms for depression. And they said, if your patients show 6 of these over a period of, I think it was a couple of weeks, then they can be diagnosed as depressed. And they're things that are fairly obvious, like, persistent low mood, feelings of worthlessness, that kind of thing. And so this goes out in the DSM, the latest edition of the DSM, and psychiatrists start to use it. And then not long afterwards, they kind of come back to the committee that wrote the DSM and they say, look, there's something a bit embarrassing here. Every grieving person, if we use this checklist, should be diagnosed as depressed.
Indeed.
Are we meant to tell every grieving person that they're mentally ill and drug them? So the psychiatrists realized this was a problem. And so they added what was called the grief exception. It's a loophole. It basically says if you show 6 of these symptoms over a couple of weeks, you're depressed, unless someone you love has died in the last year, in which case none of this applies. So then, therefore, psychiatrists start using this guideline. But over the decades that came, psychiatrists are telling people 2 things. They're saying depression is the result of a chemical imbalance in your brain or a brain disease. And at the same time, we're saying there's one situation, only one piece of context in which if you're showing all these symptoms, you don't have a brain disease, you don't have a chemical imbalance. In fact, it's perfectly natural to feel this way, right? And that tension was very uncomfortable because what it begs the question is, well, why is someone you love dying the only piece of context in which this is an understandable way to react? Why not if you've lost your job? Why not if you've lost your home? Why not if you're stuck in your job for the next 50 years and you can't bear it? Why aren't they worthy of equal pegging with, losing someone you love? And this was really challenging because it meant that these questions force us out of that paradigm. There's a paradigm that's dominated, and there are many, many good psychiatrists who see the flaws in this. I don't want to sound like I'm attacking your psychiatry. I'm absolutely not. But so American psychiatry, which has really conquered most of the world now, is built on this paradigm that what's called mental illness can be described through a checklist of symptoms that describe problems with the brain, right? And once you allow in context, once you allow in the context of life, so I spent some time talking to this incredible woman called Dr. Joanna Cassiatore. She's, Dr. Joanne Cassiatore, who is a doctor at a university in Arizona. And her baby daughter, Cheyenne, had died in childbirth in a terrible tragedy. And Joanne then later became an expert in treating bereavement. And what she saw is lots of people in her position, lots of parents whose children had died, were just being immediately diagnosed as mentally ill and just given huge amounts of drugs. So one mother, for example, whose child had died, just mentioned to her psychiatrist that sometimes at night she felt that her son was talking to her. Wasn't disturbing, it was really comforting to her. And she was diagnosed as psychotic and given these really powerful antipsychotic drugs. And of course, I think we all intuitively know that that's wrong when it comes to grief, right? Because grief is a form of love. We grieve for people because we love them, because they've meant something really profound to us, and now they're not here. In a similar way, I began to think of depression as like grief for our own needs not being met. And that's a really profound signal. That's not a pathology. Your grief is not a pathology. When someone you love dies and you're really terribly sad, that's not a pathology. Now, the way that psychiatrists reacted to this debate about the grief perception was really shocking. So they diminished it as each new edition of DSM came out. So it was down from a year to, I forget the figures there in the book, I think it's 6 months and 2 months. Now, they've just got rid of it. It's not there anymore. So now, if your baby dies at 10 a.m., God forbid, you can be diagnosed as mentally ill at 10:01 a.m. if you're showing these so-called symptoms. And I think that's really important because Joanne said to me, this shows how profoundly disconnected from pain we are as a culture. We just don't get it. We call it mental health because we want to scientize it. We're talking about emotional health. And we need to describe that in very different language.
Yeah, so try to nail down a precise definition gets us lost. And it's like you say, you have an elegant, but you didn't say your description is elegant, but you said it was simple. So it's elegant and simple. And what you're saying is it's all about connection, the lack thereof, and the power to reconnect. And as you say, this is not quantum physics that you're trying to explain, but it's not surprising, of course, that people would have a harder time understanding this than they would something like quantum physics because they've been told a story about what depression is for so long. Everyone has a different idea about what it is or what it is not. Now, I don't know, and I'm painfully aware of your time, but I don't know how much we're allowed to give away. But I do want to say, I think it's safe to say you end on an elevating note.
It's not like Agatha Christie, don't worry. There's not a twist at the end where they go like, "No, then Prozac murdered him." No, don't worry.
I was letting the suspense hang there. It's not always easy, but if you can actually break that dissonance, where you can let your guard down and start to acknowledge that your feelings and your signals, as you call them, are part of life's natural process, then it starts to become a little bit easier to see how you might get from disconnected to reconnected. Could you talk briefly about you had this excellent chapter, and I think you were talking a little bit about it just now, about sort of remapping your future, and that's one of your several elements of reconnection.
I was just thinking maybe I should have called it Antidepressants on the Orient Express or some like more commercial murder, murder on Prozac. I think you're totally right. I think that so. This is one of the most shocking pieces of research that I learned about and interviewed the guy who did it, and it relates to suicide, but it actually has massive implications beyond suicidal people. So it's a guy called Professor Michael Chandler in Vancouver, and some people will know that First Nations people in Canada, what would in the US be called Native Americans, have extraordinarily high suicide rates, and there are 196 First Nations groups in Canada, and Michael, when he started looking at the research, saw that, in fact, some of them have extremely high suicide rates and some have no suicides at all. So he spent a really long time researching, gathering evidence about the differences to see, well, what's going on here. What we found was really interesting. So some First Nations groups have really rebuilt collective control of their community. They've rebuilt their language, they control their own police force, their own schools, and some First Nations communities have not been able to do that. They're just treated like children by the Canadian state. They are really humiliated. They've got no control over anything. And what Michael found is in places where people had high levels of collective control, they had a lot of hope about the future, partly because they could see what the future would be like, because they were going to determine it. And the places there was no control, there was a lot of pessimism about the future. And what we found is this level of control correlated extremely closely with the suicide rate. I mean, the graph is really quite striking. Places with high control had very low or no suicide. Places with low control had very high suicide. I kept thinking about that a lot in the run-up to the election, the US presidential election, where I spent some time in Ohio writing about people who were trying to get out the vote for another book I'm working on. And I remember there was this one street I was on. It was in a place called Slavic City in Cleveland. I don't know why it's called that. It's not Slavic. It's one of those long streets in Cleveland where a third of the houses have been demolished, a third have been just abandoned, and a third still have people living in them. There was one place where we knocked on the door, me and Dave Fleischer, who was the guy I was writing about, canvassing, and there was this woman who answered the door who looked, to look at her, I would have guessed she was 60. I actually found out she was the same age as me, 38 at the time. And she started talking about her life and how this sense of like the future had just gone. How when her grandparents had been middle class on this street, they'd had a sense of the future, they'd had a sense of where they were going to be, her parents had. She made this verbal slip that's really stayed with me. She was talking about what the area used to be like, and she meant to say when I was young. What she actually said is when I was alive. And it really, really hit me. And I think we need to I am very, very strongly opposed to Donald Trump, as you can guess, but I think we need to stop patronizing people like this woman and start listening. Now, I don't agree with the way she chose to send her signal. I obviously don't agree with. I think Trump is making all these problems worse. But the signal of distress that they're sending needs to be listened to and honored. So that was kind of this disconnection from the future. Now, I don't want to be clear. What First Nations people went through in Canada is worse than what people in the Rust Belt are having a really hard time, but they didn't go through a genocide like the First Nations people in Canada, so I don't want to overstate it. But I do think I thought a lot about those studies, and this woman felt she had no control over her life, and she's not wrong. And one way of, so it's interesting in ways that people can be reconnected to a hopeful sense of the future. And there was actually this really fascinating, quite large scale experiment that kind of, I think, gave us the key to this. So in the 70s, the Liberal government in Canada thought there was this problem with the welfare state, where they'd had a welfare state for a fair amount of time in Canada, but obviously people were falling through the cracks. And so they chose this town. It's called Dauphin. It's in Manitoba. It's about 4 hours out of Winnipeg, for anyone who knows Canada. It's seemingly at random. It was just a relatively small farming town. And they did an experiment in what's called a universal basic income. So they basically said to everyone, from now on, you are going to be given a guaranteed income by the government. You're going to get a check. It was the equivalent of, I think it was about $17,000 in today's money. So, enough that you could live on that, not so much you could live, with any sense of luxury.
Safety net.
I said, yeah. And nothing you do can take this away. This is your right as a citizen. We're going to give this to you. And they gave it to them for 3 years, and they wanted to see what would happen. And the results, there are many results, lots of them positive, lots of women looked after their kids more because rather than rush back to work. Lots of people left shitty jobs. The average amount of work hours fell slightly. Lots more women went into education. Remember, this was a conservative farming community. But the most important result for me was there was a really significant fall in mental health problems. Mental health problems that were so severe that people were hospitalized for them fell by 9% in 3 years. Didn't happen in the surrounding areas. It was something specific to here. And I think it was exactly because it dealt with that thing that we're talking about in relation to, that was demonstrated in the First Nation study. They got back a sense of the future, right? You don't feel that sense of terrible anxiety and precariousness. Now, we can have a universal basic income, right? It's less expensive than the US defense budget by a long way. That is, and as the main academic expert on this, a wonderful person called Dr. Evelyn Forget said to me, that's an antidepressant. It's giving people back a sense of the future. It's not giving people a sense of, look, there are things that are talked about giving people back a sense of the future that are never going to happen. Trump's claims that iPhones are going to be manufactured in the United States, or that's just not. Everyone knows that's not going to happen. I think even he knows that's not going to happen. This is a way of giving people back a sense of the future that is very practical, that can happen, and that reconnects us and frees people up. Because a lot of the other things people have to do to deal with depression and anxiety, reconnecting with their community, reconnecting with meaningful values, that's really hard to do if you get home at 8 o'clock at night exhausted. Those are the precious hour or two you get to spend with your kids before you collapse, and then you have to go back the next day and the next day and the next day, and you're in this state of constant overwork just to keep your head above board, which is the case for a lot of the depressed people I know. So yeah, I think this leads to there are many things that change when you have a universal basic income. People can say no to degrading work, which means that employers have to make that work more attractive. People can reconnect with the things that really matter. But so that, I think, that's one of the biggest antidepressant programs we could have.
We're running short on time, but I want to extend that just slightly, because writing this book, I think you had a tricky landscape through which to navigate. But I think what you did was genius, and maybe it's just because I'm noticing this now that it yells in my head, but you knew that readers may feel vulnerable to be told that antidepressants are perhaps less effective than they thought, perhaps no more effective than a placebo. And in the rest of the book, you demonstrate actually how to utilize the real power of this placebo-type phenomenon as fuel to construct a more optimistic future for ourselves. And we can end here. You spoke bravely and candidly about your own experiences with depression and anxiety. Have you utilized the strategies from the book in your own life, and how do you feel these days?
Yeah, well, I'll just say that in terms of thank you for what you just said, and that that's not a rhetorical device. I really felt that. I was really, and people can see from looking back at what I wrote years ago, I really believed this chemical imbalance story, and I was really afraid of challenging it. And I'm very allergic to writing. There's this debate at the moment, if you've been following it, between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West, where both extraordinarily great African-American writers, where Cornell has been arguing that Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. So Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a book called Between the World and Me, which Cornell reads, I think, more or less rightly, as saying, look, it's written as a letter to Ta-Nehisi's son, and basically says, look, white supremacy has always been the case in the US and always will be, and we just have to survive as best we can, and it doesn't really offer you any strategies for fighting back against white supremacy. And Cornell said, that was really irresponsible, and that actually, firstly, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do to challenge these grotesque systems of oppression, and to just tell your readers, look, we're screwed, is unethical. I also don't think it's true, right? As a gay person, I've seen, and I know that racism is much more deeply entrenched in our system than homophobia, but as a gay person, I have lived through, I'm not so old, I've lived through the most incredible transformation. Things that I would never have dreamed would happen when I was a gay teenager. So the reason I mention that debate is because I am really allergic to anything that just tells people things are bad and that's the way it is. It's just not my character, right? I think that's a terrible thing to say to someone. I would never want, even if I thought it was true, I wouldn't want to say it to someone, but it's not true, right? There are very few situations in life in which individuals should be hopeless, and there's nothing they can do to improve things, especially not if they band together with other people. So in terms of applying this to myself, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because I think it can actually be cruel and offensive. I'm in an incredibly privileged position, right? I had money from my previous book. I've got all sorts of privileges in my life that meant I could change my life really significantly to reduce the things that were causing depression and anxiety to me. A lot of people, including a lot of people I love, don't have those privileges, right? I've got a relative who's a struggling single mother with 2 children who's operating in much narrower margins to change her life than I was. So I very deliberately did not write the book as a kind of solely as a here's what you can do as an individual, because I think this individualistic way of thinking is part of the problem. And also there are a lot of people who just aren't, without significant social change, their margins just aren't that great to change things. There are things they can do. I talk about lots of things they can do in the book. But actually, to deal with the core of the problem, a lot of the time we're going to have to, not in every case, but we're going to have to deal with these deeper social problems, which we have extraordinary power to change, right? We, as citizens, as people acting collectively. So certainly in terms of myself, I now connect very deeply with the work that I do. I've embedded myself much more. I was always very lucky with having great friends, but I've embedded myself much more deeply with the social connections I have. One thing that I used to do is when I would really, it goes back to that study we were just talking about by Brett Ford. When I felt down, not always, but most of the time when I could feel it coming on, the way I would try to keep my head above water would be doing something self-aggrandizing, something for myself, whether it would be, trying to get some achievement or, being nasty about someone else who, for whatever reason, or buying something for myself, just trying to keep my head above water that way. And I'm not saying I don't do any self-aggrandizing now, because I do, but what I try to do now much more is when I can feel that coming on, try to do something for someone else. Which has massively helped me. Even when you're starting to feel really bad, you can almost always make someone else feel better. Just go and sit with them and listen to them. You can almost, it's surprisingly easy to cheer people up. People are really lonely and isolated in our culture, and actually small amounts of reaching out can really boost and transform their lives. And so now when I can feel, and I certainly, because I've tried to really assimilate the lessons of all these amazing scientists and different people I've got to know, I'm not depressed now, and I haven't been for quite some time. But I try to, not be so individualistic and try to see myself rising or falling with the people that I love and with people around me, and often even with strangers. You can make strangers feel pretty good about themselves. So yeah, it's certainly led me to think very differently about my values, about the way I live, about and those were changes that were to some degree underway before I did this research. I don't want to totally overstate it, but I really feel my psychological needs are being met much more than they were in the way that I lived from when I was, a baby to when I was in my early 30s. And I think that's the main reason why I'm significantly less, I'm not depressed and anxious now. I still have moments of being unhappy, and sometimes you feel like shit, of course. And I've got a book about to come out, so I'm, anxious about that. And and it's funny because a book coming out really forces you back into this mode that I used to live in, where you're thinking about external judgment. Because when I write a book, what I do is I trick myself into thinking, well, I'm only writing this because I am personally interested in this subject and I want to know the answers, right? And so I go on these journeys and I try to figure out what's going on. And I picture a reader, but I picture a nice, friendly reader who wants to know the answers too. And then, of course, when you're getting ready for your book to come out, you suddenly realize, it's going to be critically assessed in a way that you don't. I try not to pick. You picture people who don't like you reading it, or people who are going to slag you off or whatever. And that causes there's a degree to which you just have to insulate yourself from that and not read it and so on. But so I'm closer to anxiety than I've been for many years, partly just for that reason. But no, because I'm so deeply connected to these deeper sources of psychological needs, then I don't feel that. But I want to stress, we should change our society so everyone can make those changes. And there are real, practical, concrete changes we can make, which are not, in some ways they're radical, in some ways they're quite banal. Universal basic income, control your workplace. These are not, it's not, I'm not suggesting, massive transformations of the way we live. These are adjustments to the way we live, significant adjustments, but adjustments. Yeah, sorry, that was such a long sentence that I've lost the end of my own sentence. It happens to me sometimes.
Well, no, you're doing a great service, I think, by coming on this show. One of the reasons I changed the name of the show, first of all, it was called Young Justice, so DC Comics didn't like it. But the other reason that I call it now the Social Exchange is that I want to, and I suppose you would be the exception, I want to have people on whose ideas that I disagree with a lot of times too. So that was tough with you. I agree with so much of what you say, but at least there's plenty of controversy attached to what you're trying to say. And I will just end by saying, in a world where mental health diagnoses are ubiquitous, your book dares to threaten the reliability of our standard story about it. And in the place of our antidepressant drugs, you extend the gift of meaning and self-control and hope, which is why I truly mean, without indulging, I think that this is going to be one of the most important books of the year.
Oh, wow, thanks. And I just want to, it's important to say this is not, obviously this is not something that comes from me. These are analyses that come from huge numbers of scientists, but also this is a radical position, but it's not a maverick position. This is actually the mainstream of a lot of the evidence. You look at the World Health Organization.
Sure.
Statement saying mental health is socially produced and explaining a lot of the points that I've been explaining. The UN this year, well, it might be last year by the time your listeners hear this, but the UN in 2017 for World Health Day issued a statement saying this dominant biomedical narrative about depression is based on a misreading of the science. And the phrase they used, I put the exact words in the book, was we need to talk a lot less about chemical imbalances and a lot more about power imbalances. So these insights are not they've been driven out of the public discourse, but they've not been driven out of the scientific discourse, and they are in one way uncontroversial. Now they'll be controversial in the debate because we've been so heavily propagandized. But I'm really grateful to you for reading the book in such detail, Zach, and for all the work you're doing, and we'll have to find something to disagree about at some point in the future. Oh. But I should just say, because my publishers always tell me off about it, say this, but I should say that the book Lost Connections is available obviously as a physical book, an audio book from audible.com, an ebook from anywhere you buy ebooks. And anyone who wants any more information about any of this, you can go to the book's website. It's www.thelostconnections.com. You can take a quiz to see how much you know about the real facts about depression and anxiety, and you can listen to audio of loads of the people we've been talking about, and lots more people with really amazing insights onto depression and anxiety. And I feel like there's one other thing I meant to, the book has a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/thelostconnections. Do you know, I did an interview a little while ago where I was like, they said, what's your Facebook? What's your Twitter? And then they were like, what's your Snapchat? And I was like, I am a 38-year-old man. I'll go a long way, right? But like, there would be something very sinister about a 38-year-old on Snapchat. I'm not doing that, right? So I do not have Snapchat. And if you ever see anyone on Snapchat, that is not me.
If you get it, make sure to snap some pictures of your food. No, I just want to qualify something real quick, and I know you need to go. You've been more than generous with your time. You're right. The weight of evidence is absolutely in your favor, and I think there just seems to be this sort of bandwidth problem that we have, or maybe a lag time between robust evidence and how we apply it in culture. I think that you're going to expedite this process, perhaps.
Yeah, should I tell you a little story as the very last thing?
Sure.
I really shouldn't say the story, but I will anyway. I didn't write about this. In January 2017, I was invited by Peter Thiel's venture capital fund. You know, Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder, gazillionaire, funded Trump's campaign because they were doing a conference for people designing apps to deal with depression, anxiety, and addiction. And they invited me. And actually, the people who worked for Peter Thiel were lovely and really interesting people. And I said to them, look, the idea of designing an app is to deal with these things is part of the problem, right? This whole way of thinking is part of the problem. And that very Californian way, they were like, that's great. Why didn't you come and tell us that? So I was looking for an excuse to go to San Francisco anyway. So I went. And it was absolutely fascinating. Whole day, I didn't listen to every speech. So maybe there were people who said other things that I didn't hear, but very, very distinguished scientists, very smart people. And if all you knew about depression, anxiety, and addiction was this conference, you would have thought they were spontaneous brain disorders. They spent the whole time looking at brains, pictures of brains, right? And one person mentioned childhood trauma. It was the one external thing that anyone mentioned. And I was up last to speak. I don't know if they'd done this deliberately. I don't think so. And I was trying to think, what should I say? And I thought, I don't want anything for these people, I'll be honest. And I just said, I think this is a crazy way of talking. It's not that the brain science they're describing isn't true and real and valuable. Of course it is. But, you could describe the plot of Romeo and Juliet using Newtonian physics, right? And it would all be true. No doubt the atoms in Romeo's body move a certain way, the atoms in Juliet's body. But you wouldn't understand a damn thing about why Romeo and Juliet do anything, right? You'd be missing the point. And in the same way, this desire to code our distress, and I said to them, people who know San Francisco will know what I mean. We were just next. We were not far from the Tenderloin, which is an area with a very high proportion of people with addiction problems, often homeless people with addiction problems. And I just said to them, let's just go and let's just sit with the first person you see in the Tenderloin who's got an addiction problem. Listen to their life story, and then tell them that their problem is an issue with their amygdala. It's absurd. It's an absurd. To be honest, it made me think about like the scientific conferences they'd have in the Soviet Union, where they would just say that they wouldn't discuss genetics because they would just say it was Darwinian and that was capitalist and therefore it was unseeable in their ideological system. It felt to me, and the reason I say that in relation to what you said is, I don't think it's a bandwidth problem. I think it's contrary to the ideology of our times. How convenient that Peter Thiel is a billionaire who funds Donald Trump. I'm not implying any of this is conscious. It's not conscious. It's absolutely not conscious. It's not some conspiracy or anything. But how convenient that Peter Thiel is a billionaire in a society with unprecedented inequality and social distress, and he happens to oversee this system that tells people that all that distress is just the result of their brains bizarrely and simultaneously malfunctioning, right? You can see there's a guy interviewed in, what's his name? Lawrence Kiermaier, wonderful guy. He's a professor at McGill in Montreal, who just talked about how the relationship between neoliberalism and this biomedical way of talking about distress, they are closely related. They one serves the function of the other. None of that is conscious. None of that. I'm not implying that Peter Thiel deliberately promotes that's not how it works. It's not at all how it works. That would be a bizarre, ludicrous thing to say. It's not like he's Mr. Burns or something. But we live in when I was a child, Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families. And Margaret Thatcher won, right? We really deeply believe that. She won so much that someone like me, who thinks of myself as a lefty, confronted with quite bad depression, didn't even think of it as being related to anything other than myself for more than 10 years, right? That's how much Margaret Thatcher won. We have privatized our own pain and distress. And so these things are interconnected. They're not separate. And so I don't think it's a bandwidth problem. I think it's that there are many, many, many things going on. But one of them is we created a culture where we wanted to, and I'm not saying just standing above it, where I wanted to believe that these things could be solved with a pill. They could be solved with the equivalent of going shopping. We forgot that there are some problems that can't be solved by shopping. There are some needs that aren't met by shopping. There are some needs that are deeper and more true to our nature that need to be thought of in a very different way. That's just outside the grammar of our culture as we've built it. But it's still there. You can tell people they don't live in a society, but it turns out they still have social needs. They still have profound and deep social needs that don't go away. And if you don't meet them, they'll feel terrible.
Johann Hari, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom with us.
Cheers, Zach. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you're doing. Cheers.
Thank you.